It's my belief that most, if not all, of fantasy fiction novels are attempts by writers to solve the riddles of our prehistoric past, either consciously or subconsciously, or both, depending on the writer. During most of the 20th century, science was used as a tool by a majority faction in academia in an attempt to disprove myth. But already within the first 2 decades of the 21st century, we're seeing science proving myth, whether scientists like it or not. The many hominids we once shared the world with are now becoming younger and more numerous. The red deer cave people and Mongolian Neanderthaloids in China, the famous hobbits in Indonesia, balan man in Sri Lanka, and the Iwo alero skull from Africa all serve to prove that myths of goblins, ogres, trolls, dwarves, and brownies might have some actual basis in reality. At the same time, the dawn of certain human technologies keeps getting older and older. For instance, the dawn of both agriculture and the domestication of canines may have been pushed back as much as 20,000 years from the mere 10,000 or 6,000 years that most scientists believed in the 20th century. There are what look to be domesticated tubers in an island in the Solomons that are 28,000 years old. The skull of a primitive dog has been found in the Altai region that dates to about 32,000 years before present. Pottery as well has gained about 10,000 years just within the last 15 years in China, and now dates to at least 18,000 years before present. Despite what many academians would have you believe, there are still many mysteries about our historic past that have not been fully explained by science. If your scientific theory about how we lost our fur or how we became dominant over all of the other hominids on Earth is too tinfoil, then you won't get your tenure in academia. You might be able to write a book and get asked to be on Ancient Aliens, but the safer route is to channel your theories about these mysteries through science fiction or fantasy. And especially with fantasy, I think that a lot of these artificial worlds that authors have created start from pondering our own past and the possibilities of what might have happened to bring us to where we are today. Nowhere do I find this more evident than in the works of George.R.R. Martin. George has been somewhat outspoken about authors writing in other authors' worlds, such as, I guess it's fan fiction. But as a prehistoric fiction writer, I'm finding it's very difficult not to write in George's world because George's world is essentially our own. I often find myself wanting to include little-known facts about our prehistoric world in my own works of fiction, only to find out that George has already used that. George has already used this. George has already used that. And I have this fear of people thinking I'm copying George.R.R. Martin instead of copying the actual past. Now, there's been a lot said about A Song of Ice and Fire and its parallel plots with the War of the Roses. But I think that it has many more parallels with the time of our history that has not been preserved to us, the time before written language. The world depicted in A Song of Ice and Fire is our own world about 8,000 to 12,000 years ago, not the medieval period. The family feud between the Lannisters and Starks, or Yorks and the other faction from the War of the Roses, is a type of family feud that's been happening all through the history of mankind. The Hatfields and McCoys, Romeo and Juliet. Since it's repeated so much in written history, it was probably happening way before we started writing down history. And so George simply uses this universal struggle that mankind has been having for probably 180,000 years or longer, and because he has no written language or written records of the prehistoric past. So, in a sense, A Song of Ice and Fire is something that really could have kind of happened about 12,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago. I know that sounds pretty out there, but in recent years, I've heard several pseudoscientists or investigative journalists coining the term man is a species with amnesia. In other words, we've forgotten a lot about our prehistoric past. According to many mainstream scientists, such as Dr. Stephen Oppenheimer, much of our past has been erased. Any writing or records of what might have gone on before our official beginning of written language have largely been destroyed because our coasts have been destroyed. And that's where the biggest part of our civilization probably would have been before the end of the last ice age. The fact that 50% of Americans are willing to entertain the notion that aliens might have had something to do with our origins as a species is telling. 20th century scientists did a woefully poor job of selling evolution to the public as it is written in the textbooks. And while I would like to fill in some of the gaps in our timeline in other videos, this video is primarily about G.R.R. Martin and prehistoric literary criticism and analysis of A Song of Ice and Fire. My ideas about human origins don't involve ancient aliens, but G.R.R. Martin's very well could. It makes no difference. We're not analyzing here the facts of human evolution or how it came to be. What we're analyzing are the works and the worldview on evolution that they portray. Does A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones have a purely biological academic view of evolution? If it is a straight view of evolution, then does he believe more in the out of Africa idea or the multi-regionalist idea? And even going back farther, does he believe in the Savannah ape possibility, or is he more leaning towards the aquatic ape theory, which is a little bit less accepted? If A Song of Ice and Fire doesn't have a viewpoint that is straight evolution without any help from any outside source, is he more towards the creationist viewpoint? And when I say creationist viewpoint, that can also be Hindu or Islamic or Zoroastrian or anything else. Or could Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire have a more ancient aliens viewpoint to it? And what is it saying or attempting to say about the part of our past that is closed off to us, or which has been erased by Oppenheimer's floods? What I found over the past few weeks researching this is that looking at George R.R. Martin's works from this standpoint gives me a unique perspective in trying to figure out what might be to come, or in order to help explain the world of ice and fire and what's going on. What is the big picture behind all these different factions that are coming together between the Lord of Light and the Lord of Death, or the Great Other? So we'll start with the earliest memories that any peoples in Planetos seem to have recorded from the earliest era that anyone has any records of. Essentially, the prehistoric period of Martin's world. The following is a Tor.com article from 2015 by Chris Lowe. According to the world of ice and fire, the maesters of Westeros think that mankind only emerged 40,000 to 500,000 years ago, which is more than 1,000,000 years younger than humans on Earth. The origins of humans on Earth can be traced to the grass plains of northern Central Africa, and it is suspected that the origins of humans in Westeros can be traced to a similar environment in the Dothraki Sea on Essos. The first signs of human settlements are along the rivers in the western portion of the Dothraki Sea, and cave paintings have been found west of that, south of the free city of Norvos. First, I'd like to point out that in one respect, George R. Martin has his facts much more accurate than Chris Lowe and Tor do. I'm not sure what species of mankind Chris Lowe thinks began about 1,000,000 to 1.5 million years ago, but current thought among scientists is that biped apes began sometime between 6 million and 10 million years ago. The genus Homo began sometime between 1.8 million and 2.3 million years ago, and Homo sapiens sapiens, which is us, didn't begin till sometime between 120,000 and 200,000 years ago. Up until the mid-20th century, scientists, or most scientists, believed that Homo sapiens sapien didn't begin till around 40,000 years ago. They had a very Eurocentric idea of evolution, and many scientists used to believe that the Cro-Magnons were the first Homo sapiens sapiens, and they only evolved about 40,000 years ago in Europe, and they had the same evidence as the Westerosi Maesters seem to have, cave paintings and other evidence of settlements along rivers. It's only because of advancements in genetics that we know now that Homo sapiens are likely 180,000 years old. And we also have fossils dating back to about 160,000 years old. So the Maesters are right. They're much closer to the dates than Chris Lowe is. There are some people who think that Homo sapiens sapien is a lot older, with evidence of an anatomically modern human such as Mungo Man, which split off 350,000 years ago. And there are certain Y haplogroups in Africa that are 400,000 years old. 500,000 years is about the dawn of Heidelbergensis. And it seems that both Neanderthal man and Homo sapiens sapiens split off from Heidelbergensis. So if you include Heidelbergensis and Neanderthal in the group known as humans, then George R. Martin is more accurate in that respect as well. It began about 500,000 years ago. But the point is, here you see the Maesters following our own type of progression of knowledge. At one time, we thought that Homo sapiens sapiens evolved somewhere in Asia or Europe, mostly because of cave paintings and because of Cro-Magnon bones. Later, we learned that they first evolved in Africa. And most likely, one day, Martin's maesters in the future will come to this conclusion as well if they survive this age. In the Song of Ice and Fire, Africa is Sothorios. And as we'll see by studying the histories of some of the earliest civilizations in Planetos, mankind seems to have come up from Sothorios around the JC, which is basically the Mediterranean, and into Europe from that area. Asai, the Shadow, these are all places that we don't know anything about, but they seem to be the places from whence humans, or Homo sapiens sapien, seems to have come in the story of the Song of Ice and Fire. Chris goes on to say, other species on planet Westeros are considered to be older than mankind, like the giants, the children of the forest, and quite possibly the others. Now, he's leaving out quite a few, but this is the same thing as in our own planet. There are hominids that are much older than mankind. There were the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, Homo erectus, several others. In the Wikia of Ice and Fire, which is derived from the world of Ice and Fire, they don't talk about the first inhabitants of Essos, but they do talk about the first inhabitants of Westeros. It states, in the Dawn Age, Westeros is inhabited by the children of the forest and possibly by giants in the far north. Some other semi-canonical sources say that the others were there too, or the White Walkers, if you're watching the shows. That seemingly has been contradicted by the idea that the White Walkers were created by the children of the forest in order to protect them against man, and so wouldn't have come until the arrival of man. But that isn't necessarily the case, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Whether the others or the White Walkers were there or not, we know that the children of the forest and the giants weren't the only species in Westeros when the first men arrived, for several different reasons. On the subreddit A Song of Ice and Fire, a user named Misogynist Lesbian has this to say. Many times throughout the world of Ice and Fire, there are mentions of a certain black stone. Although structures built of this black stone are similar to Valyrian's architecture due to color and having the quality of being fused smoothly together by dragon flame, it is set apart by having an oily or greasy feel to it and being unadorned rather than twisted into fancy shapes like the Valyrians are wont to do. Additionally, all have ancient and unknown origins. To recap, these mentions are the sea stone chair, the throne king of the Iron Islands, carved of oily black stone into the shape of a kraken, found on Old Wick, currently resides on Pike. 2. The foundation of the High Tower, on the mysteriously named Battle Isle, a square labyrinthine fortress of fused, unadorned black stone sits beneath the more recently built High Tower. 3. The Toadstone. On the Isle of Toads in the Basilisk Isles near Sothorios sits a 40-foot tall ancient idol of a toad, crudely carved with greasy black stone. The inhabitants of this isle have an unpleasant fish-like aspect to their faces, and many have webbed hands and feet. Yin, the cursed city in Sothorios, built entirely of huge oily black stone blocks, in which some of Numeria's Roynish people vanished overnight during their exodus, and the jungle does not grow near. Asai, The buildings of Asai by the shadow are said to consist of black stone with a greasy, unpleasant feel. It is claimed the stone drinks light, making their nights pitch black and even the sunniest days quite gray and gloomy. The city is also toxic to plants, animals, and children, although nobody knows why. May be related, may not be, but I found that eerily similar to Yin. The Five Ports. On the eastern edge of the known world, between the plains of the Jogos Nye and the Grey Waste, and just south of the Bleeding Sea, sit 5 forts whose walls of fused black stone are almost 1,000 feet high. Remember, the wall is supposed to be 700 feet tall, and it's huge. They predate the rise of the Valerian freehold as well as the Golden Empire of Yati, or Yata. Possibly the black stone which fell from the sky in Yaitai shortly before the long night and was worshipped by the Bloodstone Emperor, although that seems like more of an intentional parallel to the sword Dawn's origins at Starfall and other meteorites falling stars from the series In My Eyes. More on this later. Maester Yandel mentions a theory about these mysterious black stones from Master Theron in his manuscript, Strange Stone. Theron drew a connection between the black stone of the sea stone chair and that of the ancient fortress that serves as foundation of the high tower. He suggested they were created by the Deep Ones, a queer, misshapen race of half-men sired by creatures of the salt seas upon human women. Theron suggests they inspired the legend of Merlings, and that the sea creatures who fathered them inspired the religion of the drowned god. Additionally, the legends of Lorath claim that the Lorathi maze-makers were destroyed by creatures from the sea, whereas the inhabitants of the Thousand Isles sacrificed sailors to squamous, fish-headed gods, of which stone idols emerge when the tide is low. These folks are also hairless with green-tinged skin, filing the teeth of their women into points and cutting off the foreskin of their males. Strangely, it is said that they greatly fear the sea and will not go into it even under the threat of death. Another fish people legend is that the Squishers on the Cracklaw Point in Westeros, within the same vicinity as Driftmark, ruled by House Valerion from the Driftwood throne, which legend claims has given to them by the Merling king to conclude a pact. The Vale contains a few Merling legends. Robar Royce reputedly earned the allegiance of Ursula Upcliffe, a sorceress who called herself Bride of the Merling King. Sir Artus Arryn counted Merlings as friends, and those of House Borel on Sweetsister still tend to have webbed appendages. And don't forget Patchface's miraculous surviving of the 3 days in the sea and subsequent prophetic ability and frequent referencing of drowned god mythos after he washed up. It is possible, I say probable, that these stories and beliefs are related to Theron's Deep Ones. This Redditor goes on to compare Martin's Deep Ones to H.P. Lovecraft's Deep Ones, which I think is spot on. But Lovecraft's Deep Ones appear in a lot more stories than just Shadow over Innsmouth. She also points out that the oily black stones have a lot of similarities to Robert E. Howard's oily black stone in the story The Black Stone. But these aren't just references or nods. These are expansions on this idea that Howard and H.P. Lovecraft actually corresponded over. Martin's Deep Ones are almost exactly like Lovecraft's Deep Ones. Both Martin and Lovecraft mention also the Old Ones, which are another ancient race of sentient being who keep this power of the Deep Ones in check in some way. There seem to be no discernible differences at all between Martin's Deep Ones and Old Ones and H.P. Lovecraft's Deep Ones and Old Ones. He just tells us a little bit more about them. Maybe he even kind of updates them with modern understanding of human evolution, if you will. The idea of these deep ones also seems to serve the same kind of purpose in A Song of Ice and Fire as they did in H.P. Lovecraft's work. They're this ancient civilization that predates mankind that has some almost unknowable connection to the origins of mankind, and knowing those origins can drive a man insane. Several of Lovecraft's characters go insane after finding the evidence that the old ones are real, and we also see this happening in A Song of Ice and Fire, especially with Patchface, possibly with Aaron Damphair, as well as the Grey King of the Iron Islands and the Storm King of Storm's End, possibly even Tyrion Lannister, according to some accounts by the fandom. Arcash on Westeros.org says, I've been thinking about it recently, and I guess there are some mysteries lying under the oceans and the seas around Westeros. First of all, Cotter Pike stating that there are dead things on the water near Eastwatch. We can suppose that Hardhome was also attacked by others or something else via the Shivering Sea at the end of Dance. Patchface is resurrected after being drowned and mad since. Aaron Damphair Greyjoy, I guess there is more than meets the eyes in the drowned god religion. Too much resurrections, too. A World of Ice and Fire describes the Crannogmen of the Neck thusly. Last, and some might say the least, of the peoples of the north are the swamp dwellers of the Neck, known as Crannogmen for the floating islands on which they raise their halls and hovels. A small, sly people, some say they are small in stature because of their intermarriage with the children of the forest, but more likely it results from inadequate nourishment, for grains do not flourish amidst the fens and swamps and salt marshes of the Neck, and the Crannogmen subsist largely upon a diet of fish, frogs, and lizards. They are quite secretive, preferring to keep to themselves. South of the Neck, the river folk whose lands adjoin their own say that the Crannogmen breathe water, have webbed hands and feet like frogs, and use poisons on their frog spears and their arrows. Mirror Reed, in one of the books, informed us that Howland Reed could breathe mud. There are names for these deep ones or their offspring, hybrid offspring or otherwise, all over Planetos. They're called merlings, mermaids, mermen, selkies, squishers, and other names for these fish people. Those who seem to worship them in the Far East file down their teeth to sharpness. The small folk of Westeros say that these fish people look normal enough until you get up close to them, and behind their mouths they have these rows of sharp pointed teeth. The cultures from the Far East of Essos who worship these fish people file their teeth down to sharpness, or at least the women do. Biter, who is a prisoner with Jaqen and Rorge during the first and second and third books, I believe, has teeth that are filed to sharpness, and he also has slits all over his body that could be a primitive homage to gills. And there are even theories that Varys is one of the fish people. They say he never smiles because he's actually got, or he smiles, but he doesn't open his mouth and show his teeth, probably because his teeth are pointed. And they've got other little tinfoil Easter eggs that point to both Varys and Illyrio being fish people. There's even a theory that Benjen is a fish person, and that all of them are ruled by Littlefinger, whose house has some indications of some kind of Merling ancestry. And while I may not buy into all of that, it's evident that George has put enough web fingers and oily stones and references to Merlings and deep ones that it's going to be at least somewhat important to the story. I think it's going to be a major part of the story and a big reveal, plot twist. But at the same time, I don't think we'll ever know everything about the origins or the deep ones. We may only go as far as the Merlings and the Squishers, because George is using this deep one mystery for a horror element in a story, just like H.P. Lovecraft did before him. However, there's a lot that we can learn from it, and we can use this to predict what's going to happen in the story, and use it to see what A Song of Ice and Fire's interpretation of our own human prehistory is. Well, thanks for watching my prehistoric analysis of Game of Thrones. Next week we'll be talking about the real life amphibian god cults that inspired Game of Thrones. We'll be talking more Lovecraft Martin, and we'll delve down to the very origins of grayscale. So please subscribe so you don't miss a thing.